Thank you, Tala, for that. We welcome Mr. Stephen Martin with us today to talk to us about the ethical considerations for the conduct of health research in humanitarian crises. I just want to say that unfortunately Dr. Arawi will not be able to join us today due to a conflicting WHO meeting. So we will be having the talk as usual with Mr. Martin for 20 to 30 minutes, and then it will be followed by questions. So allow me to introduce Mr. Martin. Mr. Stephen Martin is a member of the Center for the Study of Global Movement at the University of Cambridge. He is a senior researcher in the Center for Disaster and Humanitarian Ethics at the GE2P2 Global Foundation and is an associate lecturer at Glasgow Caledonian University with over 10 years experience in epidemiology and public health. Since 2003, Mr. Martin has been involved in a number of refugee charities, and in 2012 has volunteered in a number of refugee camps in the West Bank, France, Belgium, and Greece. His work combines research, teaching, advocacy, and field work to raise awareness and contribute towards positive changes for a disadvantaged population group. He is currently involved in cross-disciplinary research activities spanning public health, mental health, human movement, and social justice, and is currently authoring a book on the ethical issues encountered during the conduct of health research and humanitarian crises. He also recently co-authored an article, a correspondence article, in The Lancet with Dr. Arawi under the title, "Ensure Palestinians Have Access to COVID-19 Vaccines." And it was released on February 27, last month. So welcome, Mr. Martin. And hello.
Oh. Hi, sorry about that. Hi, Diane. Sorry, I've been having some problems with the mute there.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invite. I'm really happy to be here to talk about this issue today. I just want to mention two of my colleagues who's been helping with this presentation, Donald and Alana, who are also involved in the project. So, sorry, I'm having, yeah, got it. So just to give you a bit of an overview on what I'll be talking about today, I'm going to give you a little bit of background to the project. I'm going to talk about the methods that we used, and we're going to spend most of our time talking about the findings. I'm going to try and give you a brief overview of the context. We're going to talk about research, design, including community engagement, production costs, distribution, community access, and then provide a summary at the end. So the PRIA project is investigating ethical issues in humanitarian health research. So it aims to identify good practice and develop a tool to help researchers reflect on the issues that arise. I'm going to be talking about one aspect of the project, which is systematic review. However, we have done qualitative research, but I'm not going to be reporting on that today. So I'm just going to very quickly go through the methodology. We looked at any kind of research study design. We looked at all stakeholders, and that was conducting research in humanitarian settings. We looked at a wide range of outcomes, perceptions, views, attitudes, ethical, moral, and cultural issues regarding health research conducted in humanitarian crises. We conducted electronic searches of databases, including Medline, PsycInfo, Web of Science. And we also conducted a grid search, looking at key organizations such as UNICEF, MSF, And this is a search strategy that we used. So it's quite comprehensive. In the first section, you can see our terms related to ethics and morals. Our second set of terms are related to health, research, or epidemiology, public health. And the final set of terms are related to humanitarian disasters or crises. So this is a result of the grey literature. We identified quite a few thousand documents in total. And these are the results of our academic search. We followed a traditional systematic review procedure where we reviewed each title, abstract, and full paper, deciding what should be included and what should not be included. Here's our flow diagram. I should say at the moment we have 373 papers included, but we have more to go through, so that number will change. So this is very much interim results. We conducted an evidence synthesis using in vivo to pull out all the themes that emerged from the literature, and obviously given the heterogeneity of the evidence, we could not perform a meta-analysis. Quality of evidence is also an issue in this area. Quality assessment tools looking at ethical inquiries are underdeveloped, and so we decided not to do an assessment of the quality. I should say a number of treatment and intervention, a number of issues related to treatment and interventions were identified, and in this analysis, we haven't restricted it to pharmacological or non-pharmacological interventions. So these are some of the findings related to treatment and intervention. And obviously today we're focusing on access and availability. I do want to mention we looked at other issues like affordability and costs, compassionate use, monitored use of untested interventions, profitability, looking instead of therapeutic need. These were all mentioned in today's talk, but we're going to be mostly focusing on access and availability. Okay. I should say if anybody's got any questions, please feel free to jump in. So yeah, just a bit of a background. So while it's unethical to withhold any intervention from victims of a disaster, access to these treatments have been a contentious issue for a while. And historically, there's been no obligation for researchers to provide any treatment that is unavailable in the host country. And of course, this is already on top of existing inequalities around provision and access to services, including lack of medication. Now, access to investigational compounds is usually granted by regulatory agencies. And this will only be done if there's sufficient evidence that these compounds are safe and effective for use. So the availability of the candidate medicines themselves impact on the ethical decisions on the kind of trial designs we'd want to make. So the choice of design could be based around the ethical concern that everybody should have access, but this is quite problematic. There are also issues around fair selection of participants, informed consent, the use of placebo controls, and obviously intentionally withholding vaccines from people so they can serve as a control group. You've got issues of access regarding the inclusion criteria of a study, professional privilege, issues around, I said it may be not accessible, and obviously the lack of alternatives in some contexts or it can be problematic. So researchers need to provide care and treatment to individuals, but offering care and treatment may also impact on the study itself and be for us to impact the effectiveness of the vaccine. There's also the potential for harm and the need for rescue therapies. So decisions about design could come around compassionate access. But again, some people would argue that compassionate access may be unethical because it does not generate adequate data. And obviously there are uncertainties, as I've said, about whether or not these candidates can be made available, and the guidance isn't clear. So these are just a few issues that we're talking about the design. Now, problematically, all these can arise when research is conducted with guidelines. So one of the kind of solutions to this has been suggested about community engagement and how we bring people together to negotiate access to products and the benefits from research. And obviously this needs to include a wide range of representatives from the local stakeholders, and they needed to talk about issues such as payments, royalties, subsidies, and intellectual property. But once the research has been completed, the actual production of the vaccine then creates its own complexities and ethical challenges. And again, there is need for further regulatory approval and licensing before they can reach the individual. Now, from the perspective of pharmaceutical companies, there were issues around procurement, prescribing, lack of stock. Social issues include non-compliance and the overseeing of testing. So research institutions should try and make access to the vaccine or to the therapeutic through quality healthcare services. And researchers, IRBs, and manufacturers could consider the obligation to provide drugs free. And this gets us onto the other issue, which is around costing. So once production has been achieved, treatment may be difficult due to cost. So study teams need to really consider this as they're going forward, and they need to engage with governments so they can ultimately come in and help inform pricing. There are issues that life-saving medicines are not often affordable. This is often because companies are profit-orientated and they charge huge prices for their drugs, and they're reluctant to develop drugs that are essentially not profitable. So they're focused more on lucrative markets, for example, around impotence, than they do for malaria or tuberculosis. So for some people, it's clear that actually the market doesn't do well in this effort. They choose to reward shareholders rather than benefit patients. And obviously this has led to discussions around compulsory licensing, and very much things that we're talking about in today. There's also issues on the distribution of vaccines. So how do we make distributions equitable and effective? How do we decide who gets priority? What personal and civic obligations are involved in that? So for some, access should be based on a clinical criteria that will allow for data collection, but without preferential treatment for people, in order to avoid further social inequalities. Participants in research should have access to drugs after completing or voluntarily withdrawing from studies. And it should never really be the case that people only have access when they're taking part in research. People should be able to access care. Researchers need to support participants through this process, so they need to support them in their health. And most people affected are burdened by high disease rates, inaccessible medical care, and so quite often they're not in a position to refuse participation in research. So guidance is needed to prevent exploitation of vulnerable individuals, but with a focus on equitable distribution of vaccines, but also the benefits and burdens. There are also ethical considerations about healthcare worker access. For example, in the context of Ebola, there was a lot of discussion around access for healthcare workers. ZMAP was pretty much exclusively given to healthcare workers, and there were justifications for this around staff would understand informed consent better if you treat the staff, and they will be able to treat other people. And obviously, health workers are at high risk. But some people argue against this prioritization, saying it could exacerbate existing inequalities. There are issues around who decides then who gets the access. And there's also noted that healthcare workers tend often to be pretty privileged and already well embedded in the medical establishment. Guidance suggests that there are further issues around community access, something on from healthcare practitioners. For example, the WHO and UNAIDS have come out and published numerous guidance saying that whatever's developed as a result of the specimens or the diagnosis should be offered to local people at a price they can afford. So the promotion of equitable access to services and ensuring that communities have opportunity to benefit, therefore need to underlie research taken in humanitarian disasters in complex settings. But despite all this, post-trial access communities is a complex political process. We need to minimize exploitation and promote social value, but there is a risk of exploitation if the specimens used to develop these treatments and interventions are not accessible to the communities and the individuals from which they were obtained, or when the specimens provide more profit to the corporations than the community. Yeah, there are also concerns about further care participants, their families, and the community. And we need to think about things like electricity, missing medical commodities, staff changes, and training, especially in humanitarian crises. There's also concerns that there's a lack of access for mental health treatment and trauma. And it's important to offer evidence-based treatment to all participants of research. However, groups like asylum seekers, refugees, undocumented workers, victims of trafficking often have been reported that they're not eligible to receive assistance. Being pregnant has limited people's access. For example, during Zika and Ebola, manufacturers did not allow women to take the medicine. The enrollment of children has in the past proved an issue. There are currently issues around risk, minimal risk, and the role of parental consent. So, problematically, I mean, essentially what I'm saying, we have a lot of problems. So the lack of options for people has an external influence on their decision to participate. There were uncertainties about risk procedures and minimal ethical interventions. Many interventions historically that have been effective in clinical trials have not become available in developing countries where the research was carried out. And although researchers work with host nations, they can't force anybody to do anything about the pricing. Government authorities may also be reluctant for political reasons to approve drugs. And justice, the concept of justice does not oblige external research actors to improve the healthcare systems of host communities. Issues of physical bottlenecks like manufacturing capacity, geographical accessibility are issues. And also we've mentioned how the communities are formed. Access may exacerbate social inequalities if done incorrectly. Again, there's issues over product rationing, access, acquisitions, and long-term sustainability. For law, they just said it was simplistic to assert that, law asserted that research will be unethical, essentially, if we can't guarantee access to treatments for our participants. So there is a need for researchers, sponsors to secure access, and there is a need to develop local and national capacity. When you think about drug supply chains, authorization, and commitments to ensuring access, we do need to think of the differing perspectives. We need to focus on the populations most in need, and we need to look at how publicly funded research can really improve healthcare. There's a need to do this as early as possible. We need to start planning as soon as possible, and we also need a bottom-up approach to how this research is funded. We need frameworks to help us guide to make sure that we're not being exploitative of people. And we need to better integrate into existing care plans in the countries we're working. So I've tried to quickly go through this, and so there are a range of ethical issues regarding access to treatments, which we've unravelled. And some of these can be assessed by independent ethics committees before they go, and that's important. I do want to say that, as I mentioned at the start, we're still writing up the results, and the original search was conducted in 2018, and so issues around vaccine nationalism, which are emerging in COVID, will eventually make it into our findings, but at the moment we're still a little bit behind. I guess what we're trying to say is that, sorry, I'm just moving on. I guess what we're trying to say is that there's a tension between procedural ethics around guidance and the pragmatic ethics that happens in a field. And we need training and understanding by all stakeholders involved. And we need to think of it as a dynamic process from before the research starts to after it's completed, published, and written up. And this might require some kind of cultural change in the way we think about ethics and research. And numerous authors have said there's a need for an ethics tool or an ethics help desk. And this is, again, something that we're working on. I've tried to do that very quickly. I would like to dedicate this to my former colleague, Chesmo, who was the former PI on the project, who sadly died quite young a few years ago. The project was funded by the R2HC, by the Wellcome Trust, and DFID. I'm more than happy to receive any questions or any feedback. And I realise I've used a lot of references which can be supplied upon request.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen, for this. I mean, definitely, it was a quick overview because many of these points in themselves can, many of the ethical issues in themselves can be a topic and of discussion by itself. Now, let's see if we have any questions from our participants. It can be either in the chat or through direct intervention. Anyone? Okay, so allow me to maybe ask something. In the end, would it be okay if you can open the slides again?
Oh, sure. Sorry,
Yeah. So in the last two slides, I think, because you mentioned something about the COVID situation, and
yes.
that this study was conducted in 2018.
Yes.
And you're still working on the results. So now, how do you think? I mean, given that this is still something that you're working on, but how do you think the COVID-19 research, and will it be different? I mean, will the results, if you were to do the review on new studies, the research studies being conducted in the context of COVID-19, do you think there will be new issues are going to emerge, the ones that you discussed and that you have found so far, and or is the emphasis going to be on shifted towards specific things that perhaps were not as relevant before?
I think there will be lots of new findings. I mean, we are updating the search at the moment, and I've identified more than 1,000 papers already where we could include in the review, and some of those are COVID. So we are far from identifying every single ethical issue. I mean, I think there were about 14 themes in all. I think we've got nearly 900 individual ethical issues that we've identified, and we are not close to theoretical saturation. We know that there are new ones. Vaccine nationalism, for example, which has been spoken about as an ethical issue. That's relatively new with the COVID era. And I think, I mean, countries like my own, like Britain, countries like the US, they've actively undermined the COVAX initiative, and I believe they've acted unethically during this pandemic. So I believe there will be lots of new issues arising, and hopefully once we rerun the search properly, we will identify several novel ethical issues regarding COVID.
So, do you think that it would be fair to compare like what the situation of or what happened or what was learned from the Ebola and the Zika virus? Because you also mentioned, you touched upon that in your presentation, with the COVID-19, and has there been like an exploration of what those two examples taught us, or do you feel that the community has failed to learn from these epidemics previous at them?
I think so. Countries like Sierra Leone have got much better surveillance systems now than they did pre Ebola. So we have learned things, yes. I think one of the key differences is that COVID has a negative impact on white people. to put it simply, I think if COVID was heavily regional, heavily localized, and it wasn't affecting the West, we would not have seen the amount of funding go into it. We wouldn't have seen the scientific energy go into it. Yeah, I think there are. Yeah, I mean take for example the Ebola. Treatments were not being developed for Ebola in between outbreaks. We've had a host of new treatments from the outbreak. I mean, it's a decade ago, but before that, it was very much ignored, and that's because it didn't impact on the West. I think it mentioned in the talk, pharmaceutical companies much prefer to develop drugs like, drugs related to obesity, which is essentially, a disease of the West, rather than invest in treatments for dengue fever or malaria, simply because I think there's
this is an issue of the pharma and who is conducting most of the research to develop the vaccines and the drugs, I guess. I think we have a question from someone in the audience. In the chat, it's from Diane Saab. She says, thank you for your talk. I have a question, please. Do you think it will be ethical to try out vaccines on children and do research among them so that they actually benefit from the COVID-19 vaccine, as long as the ones available are for adults only?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. So there's lots of researchers who, their entire body of research is with children, and I'm sure there's lots of strong ethical justifications on why you cannot exclude children from medical treatment. There are, however, added complexities with experimental treatments which are new, and again, I think part of it is linked to parental consent. Actually, or how willing would parents be to allow their children to participate in studies where the safety and efficacy of the treatment or the vaccine is completely unknown. So yeah, I think there is a role for children. How, whether or not it can be the exact same vaccine, I mean, I'm not an immunologist or a pharmacologist or a virologist, so I don't understand the some of the biological differences maybe that would need to be considered. or the size, the dose size. But yeah, I believe that especially if you define a child, how you define a child as well. So again, in Britain, it is anybody under the age of 18. But if a 17-year-old has, a few months until their 18th birthday, there's lots of complexities around that. But it's a good question. It's a yeah.
Okay. Was this part of the criteria in the study, or I was just wondering, is it for the previous review for like research on children? Is it like a category in of itself, or
It wasn't. So let me take you back to the search terms. From memory, we didn't look for children specifically. We were more looking for we were more looking for ethics issues in health research in crises. So we weren't concerned so much about the population. We were interested in children and old people. But obviously, there's limited research on children. There's in crises. There's limited research on disability as well. There's limited information on prisoners. So there's lots of groups where data is lacking. Children, pregnant women, often excluded from research, simply because of concerns about, as we said. I'm not sure if that helped answer the question. Sorry.
No worries. Okay, thank you for that. I think we have a hand raised by Ms. Houri Puzania.
Yes. Hi, this is Houri from the School of Nursing. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, and the topics that came up about. I think they're really important, and of course my concern is also the COVID-19 crisis and the vaccine distribution. I've been thinking, most of our focus has been vaccine efficacy, and with the accelerated vaccine development, even accelerating the phases of clinical trials with phase 2, phase 3, etc. The focus has been on efficacy, and then there's the whole other part of effectiveness, where you also hinted to that in your talk in terms of how this could be translated to real life use of the vaccine, and whether it's cost of the vaccine, otherwise handling, storage, temperature, etc. So I think an important concept that I also noted in your talk was community engagement. So in, for example, translating the use of these vaccines in rural areas, for example, what would be some processes that would relate to community engagement? How would you, in the literature, did you come across, how community engagement could bring about, better, perhaps, equal, probably more equal distribution of the vaccine and allocation of this?
There's a few examples of projects which had adopted the use of community advisory boards, and the community advisory boards would help inform informed consent procedures. They would help inform dissemination of information. They would help inform the direction of the study. From memory, I can't remember the name of. There's a lot of work coming out of Oxford on the Myanmar border with Thailand, and there's there's working with the refugee community on the border, and part of their research is, yeah, like I said, informed by a community advisory board, and they've reported a lot of successes by adopting community engagement. They've been able to reach more people. They've had better, raised awareness and improved people's understanding of the topics. People have become aware of, informed consent. How informed are the people? How really informed are they when they consent? And if you don't speak, if there are conceptual issues around, because not every culture has a concept of randomization. So community engagement has worked very well to help explain these concepts. Is that answering your question? Sorry, or?
Okay, thank you. I'm just thinking about, how vaccine allocation perhaps is run at the macro level, but then, engaging the community would be perhaps important in improving effectiveness. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I can, if you want to, I can send you the papers that I'm talking about in Thailand if you send me an email. Sorry, I can't remember the authors' names off the top of my head. Like I said, we've looked at a lot of studies, so I can't remember every single author. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Huri. It's actually a very interesting question, and I was wondering the same thing. So if we have any other questions? Okay. I just had one. You mentioned also in the end, there's an initiative that you're working on with the GE2P2.
Yes. Yeah. So
could you elaborate on that?
It's not so much a concrete initiative. It is something that we've been talking about as an ongoing concern. So a number of authors have reported the need for something like a help desk, because while you can make plans, ethical issues arise in the field which are unexpected. For example, I have a colleague who did some work on palliative care in a refugee camp in, I believe it was Bangladesh, and they'd prepared the information sheets for the participants. They prepared the consent forms in the local languages as per the guidance recommended or instructed. But when they got to the camp, they actually found the levels of illiteracy was much higher than expected. And even though it was translated, and even though they'd gone through all the processes that they'd been instructed to, they still couldn't. The people weren't able to understand what the research was about because they were illiterate, and so they had to change their process because of an unpredictable event during the research. And yeah, so they were saying, like, some advice would have been great for them on how to deal with that unexpected, the unexpected characteristic of the population that they, yeah.
So here, you mentioned an important point, which is the preparatory work before. So we're talking about maybe introducing a new vaccine to a certain community, and understanding that the community needs to have a minimal understanding, at least, of what is happening. And I mean, we need to look into how much we need to invest in educating them to their level about the basics of what this medicine or this vaccine that's being introduced. And And this is where you mentioned informed consent comes in. I mean, if they don't have a minimal sense of understanding of what this is doing, what this drug is supposed to do, then what does that say about the informed consent process? Is it a full informed consent or not? Correct me if I'm
Yeah, no,
if
you're right.
I'm
I mean, yeah, no, I think you're correct. Yeah, I think there's in 2008 when we had the global financial crisis, which was a crisis inflicted largely by irresponsible financing and irresponsible banking. Now, our governments, I mean, I'm speaking of Britain and America, we spend trillions of pounds on trying to rescue the banks. And at the moment, we are in a huge worldwide crisis, and that is causing a lot of suffering and a lot of death, and we are not willing to put in the same amount of financial resource. And I am completely amazed by that, because this crisis is huge, and you know, nobody's to blame for this. We couldn't have, it's not like somebody has intentionally um, um, made people suffer, but we need an equal response. We need to be treating this just as seriously as we did our financial crisis. And unfortunately, in my own opinion, we have a series of politicians who are willfully ignoring the evidence and making decisions based on finance and um, you know the market, essentially. And I don't think it's ethical. I don't believe, against my own personal view, I don't believe the market is capable of delivering what we needed to deliver in this COVID context. And our reliance on the market is really problematic, because it does, as I said, our Western governments have essentially undermined COVAX. It's all focused on not meeting clinical need, but meeting, just getting everybody in Britain vaccinated and not really paying attention to what happens with the rest of the world. It's an incredibly insular, inside looking attitude, which is not going to be beneficial for anyone in the long term. It's incredibly selfish by our governments to be doing this, I think. But I don't want to get into a political rant. But yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, we're talking about health ethics, and of course, it ties into ethics of our economies, our the political situation, and of course, they all tie in together. So
I mean, the way I look, I mean, we need issues around accountability as well. And so, where's the accountability of the people who are making decisions? The access and availability of COVID vaccines is really important at the moment, and you have people making decisions around who can get it, who can't, without any accountability. If I was a public health consultant and I had made some really terrible decisions that had cost the lives of thousands of people, I would lose my job straight away. I would not be employed anymore. Politicians, it seems, we have to wait 4 years before we can tell them, actually, you've done a terrible job. I think, at this moment when it's so many lives are at stake, we need extra accountability from decision makers, because it is the most vulnerable who suffer in the end. Hello?
Hello, Mr. Stephen. Thank you so much.
Oh, no, no worries. I wasn't sure if that was, yeah. So.
Does anyone else have any question regarding the topic? Oh, okay.
Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so if we don't have any further questions, I don't want to delay everyone, and I think we can wrap up our session today. Thank you very much, Stephen. Really appreciate your time, and we definitely have much more to discuss regarding the issue, as we just touched upon very important issues today. And so we hope to have you with us for more discussions in the coming future. And yeah, thank you very much.
No, thank you very much for inviting me. As I said, I'm very, very honored to be invited.
It's our honor. Okay, thank you, everyone, and I think we can wrap up for today.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you soon with us in our upcoming webinars as usual.
Thank you. Thank you.